Welcome to DSO Live from Orchestra Hall. I'm your host, Dayna Clark. This is the second concert of the DSO's French Festival. You can see all the concerts, film screenings, and events at dso.org/FrenchFest. Today, I'm here with Elizabeth McLain, a scholar of music and spirituality, to talk about today's concert. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thanks.
Your first time on the show.
Yep.
Good to have you here. Now, it seems like we usually encounter 19th century French composers at the opera. Can you explain why we don't hear more 19th century French symphonies?
Yeah, that's right. If you look at the Baroque period or the classical period, there's a number of composers that'll work in different genres, instrumental, opera, ballet. But that was before the French Revolution. So you have people like Lully, for example, who would work for the court of Louis XIV, the Sun King, writing beautiful music for Versailles, whatever he needed. Sacred music, ballets, operas, music to dance to.
Okay.
But after the French Revolution, you have a bit of an interruption of musical life. Once Napoleon kind of pulls everything back together, he wants to create a meritocracy in the educational system. So this applies to a number of different fields. There's a different way of thinking about how jobs should function. So the musicians themselves end up being not court musicians for any sort of monarch, but musicians for the state, for the greater French good. So they are told to write music for the ballet, incidental music for the theater, and operas, because that's what was very popular.
At that time.
At that time, exactly. And this is still a time when musicians of the past were not played. It was, you wanted to hear the latest, greatest thing. Now, Germany, on the other hand, they have a bit of a different tradition. They didn't have quite as big of a disruption in their political life. So after Beethoven, they continue writing these absolute musical forms, and they become masters of it. So you get a distinction between the nationalism in France, playing out at the opera, again, service of the state, glory of the French, training for all of the musicians being how to perform in those contexts, so the composers how to write for those contexts, versus the German masters who were beginning to write for local symphonies, that sort of thing.
So what made Saint-Saëns different?
Well, Saint-Saëns was a benefit of a couple of different trends. We've talked a bit about nationalism, but his version of French nationalism was, we should be able to compete with the Germans. There's no reason why we can't write what they write and write it better. Secondly, historicism. So the notion that nations are looking back at their history, coming up with their identity based on what came before, but also in music, playing composers that had not been heard in a long time. So he's involved in the Bach revival in France, so playing the music of Bach, where Mendelssohn was doing the same thing in German-speaking lands. Mozart, Handel, he absolutely adored Handel. And he's very, very invested in those traditions. At the same time, people like Liszt, who were composing new symphonic pieces, were not getting played much in France. So it was Saint-Saëns himself who begins premiering all of these, these great symphonic works by Liszt. But at the same time, he says, I should be able to write this.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why did he compose in abstract forms like the piano concerto and symphonic works like Danse Macabre?
It was intentionally to try to have some sort of challenge to this German hegemony in those classical forms. And it really wasn't until the Franco-Prussian War that anyone else agreed with him. So when the French lose, somewhat embarrassingly, to the point that the Second Empire ends, they depose their emperor and they have a new republic, they say, we really need to find some way that we can stand against, German-speaking lands, Prussia, Austria, in the arts. So that's the time where he can help form what is called the Société Nationale de Musique Française.
Oh, glad you said that.
The National Society for French Music.
Okay.
So for the next few years, that becomes critical. Now, he wrote the Marche Héroïque, the Heroic March, during the Franco-Prussian War, but it's not premiered until after the war and actually by this new society. So by the time you get the Danse Macabre, they have an audience. They have people who want to hear this French symphonic music.
Why did symphonic works become more popular in France near the end of the 19th century?
It was largely Saint-Saëns' doing. So he'd had a bit of a fraught relationship with the opera. He wanted to be an opera composer, but he became known while he's at the conservatoire and writing organ music as someone who, he just writes these nasty symphonic pieces and he can't compete at the opera. So it was really when he shows their success that other people have a venue to perform it.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction. We'll talk to you later on at intermission. We're going to send you to the concert now, but before that, we have a video about two special DSO patrons. We'll be back at intermission. I'm Dayna Clark.